Thank you all for taking a little bit of your holiday weekend to spend here this morning. So before we get going, this is our class schedule. I don't know if anybody here is new, but the first 2 weeks we talked about Luther and the Reformation. We compared different churches to the Lutheran Church. And today I'm going to talk about the Lutheran denominations. I'm going to kind of take the long way around to get there, so have a little patience, indulge me. But does anybody have any questions before we get rolling or comments? If not, I'm going to go all the way back to Luther just for a minute. The Marburg Colloquy, that's one of those moments in history where I think it's really interesting to kind of ask, what if this had gone a different way? So the Marburg Colloquy was organized by Philip of Hesse. And he was one of those guys, he was a prince who really felt that the Protestant churches needed to come together to form a united front against the Holy Roman Empire and the Pope. And so he organized this meeting of all the reformers of the day. And now, 1529, that is just, 1517 was the 95 Theses. So that gives you an idea how quickly things were moving here. And so, we think about Luther as being the dominant figure, but there were a lot of reformers who were, doing their own thing. And this was a meeting to get them all together. There was something like 12 different reformers there. But the real superstars were Luther and this guy, Ulrich Zwingli. So he is kind of the pre-Calvin reform guy. So he's kind of the proto-Calvinist. So he was in Switzerland. Calvin wasn't really on the scene yet. And he was putting forth the ideas that would kind of become Calvinism. And so really what we remember this colloquy for was Luther and Zwingli getting together and trying to hash out the differences between Reform and Lutheran. It didn't go great. It lasted about 4 days. They were both very difficult personalities. They thought they knew it all. But somewhat surprisingly, they did come to an agreement on 14 points. So they made a ton of progress. But the 15th point, they could not agree on. And the colloquy disbanded without agreement on that. And Reform and Lutheranism never really got together in any meaningful way. Well, not never. We'll get to that in a minute. But so what that meant was that, let me just say what the 15th point was. Anybody guess what the 15th point was about? What is it always about?
Eating together.
Communion. Absolutely. Luther, we talked about this before, in, with, and under, so it's kind of, how does Christ relate to the body, the bread and the wine? Luther had his statement, which you're probably a little bit familiar with. He believed that the human body of Christ was ubiquitous and present in all places, and so was present in the bread and the wine. Zwingli said that Christ in his deity was omnipresent, but in his human body could only be present in one place, and that place was at the right hand of the Father. And he went so far as to say what Luther is saying is tantamount to cannibalism, that you're actually eating, So he wasn't taking any of the subtlety that Luther was trying to put in there seriously at all. And they absolutely could not agree on that. And that became the foundational difference between Reform and Luther. There was some cooperation between princes after that, but not between princes who were Reform-based and Lutheran-based. And so Zwingli kind of met a terrible end. He was very radical. He was in Switzerland, and he wanted all of the cantons of Switzerland, all of the states of Switzerland, to become his version of Protestants, not Roman Catholic. And in order to facilitate that, he did things like trying to cut off food supplies to Catholic areas. Not a real pleasant method of doing that. So eventually, the Holy Roman Emperor had to send in the armies to try to sort this out. They made peace for a little while, but eventually they had a big battle. The Lutheran princes did not help. Again, that divide. Zwingli was at the front of the army for his side, and he was killed in battle. It would take a little while, but eventually Calvin would kind of take up that mantle and continue that on. But I go back to the colloquy and just kind of think, well, what would have happened if they had come to an agreement there? There might have been this united front of Protestantism against the Holy Roman Empire, and things might have played out differently. Not necessarily better in the long term, but differently for sure. What wound up happening was there was an awful lot of tiny little wars spread out all over the continent between Protestant forces of one type or another and the Holy Roman Empire. And this went on for over 100 years, just continual battles, and kind of peaked with the 30 Years' War. The 30 Years' War is remembered for just how terrible it was. Sweden got involved. If you ever go on a Rhine scenic cruise, there's some lovely castles, but there's also a lot of ruins. If you go to those ruins and find out about them, a lot of them were ruins that were made by Sweden invading that part of what's now Germany. There are places in Germany where over 50% of the population died during the 30 Years' War. That's the entire population, not just the soldiers. It was really, really brutal. And it was so brutal that the resulting peace of that was pretty profound. That was the peace of Westphalia. Everybody involved kind of realized we just cannot keep doing this. We need to come up with some sort of a model for how we can live together. And one of the main things to come out of the Peace of Westphalia is this concept, cuius regio, ius religio, which means whose realm, his religion. So the basic idea was that a prince has the right to impose his religion on his region, and outside forces cannot override that. So, like in Scandinavia, that works out really cleanly because all of the Scandinavian rulers were Lutheran. So they imposed the Lutheran faith. They had already done that, but now that became kind of official and understood by everybody. And that goes still to today. The Church of Sweden, the Church of Norway, the Church of Denmark, the Evangelical Church of Finland and the Church of Iceland are all Lutheran, and it stems from that time. Germany is a lot more tricky because Germany wasn't a thing. There was no Germany. There were a lot of German speakers, but there are all of these principalities spread all over the place. And so those individual princes were deciding whether to be Roman Catholic or Protestant, but even more, they were deciding whether to be Lutheran or Reformed. We tend to think of Germany as being Lutheran, and to a large extent it is. There's an awful lot of Lutheran-based churches in Germany, but it is definitely not exclusive. There are Reformed churches in Germany, and there are regions where the churches are Reformed, and it goes back to this time. The prince of that region was Reformed. Germany didn't really exist until 1871, when Prussia kind of rallied everybody, used overt nationalism to build Germany. Yeah?
Was that the Second Reich?
Oh, good question. I believe that's correct, that they would have considered the Bismarck time the Second Reich. I honestly am not 100% sure of that. The Third Reich, obviously, we know is the Nazi time. But in the 1800s, Prussia was becoming the dominant force. Yeah, go ahead.
Bavaria is primarily Catholic.
Correct, yeah. So different regions, Bavaria is to this day almost exclusively Catholic. The Rhineland is usually Catholic. There are certain pockets that are not, but it comes from this time where those princes were Catholic. My relatives, some of my relatives are from the Navarre Valley, which is a tributary of the Rhine, and it's far enough away from the Rhine that that's pretty much Protestant, although they do have a Catholic church through it too. But yeah, so that all comes from that time. But again, there were some Reformed areas as well. And there were Reformed churches sprinkled around too, that, most of the princes didn't forcibly make everybody become Lutheran. Some did. But in Prussia, they were the ones who were leading the charge for forming Germany. But they also still recognized this problem of having different Protestant churches. And so they basically just said, we are uniting the Reformed and the Lutherans, and you have no say about it. You are now one church. Enjoy yourselves. And for the most part, it worked. There were some people who did not want to be forcibly moved into a united church, and those are some of the immigrants who came to the United States. I don't have a lot of proof of this, but I am willing to bet that those immigrants are some of the more conservatives, or their relatives are some of the more conservatives in the Lutheran Church today. But definitely, let's take a look here. So what wound up happening then over time was, first of all, we get to the wars. And we could spend a lot of time talking about what happened to religion in the wars. If you've ever taken Pastor Mark's classes on Bonhoeffer, that gives you some indication of some of the stresses. So things became a lot more about, are you supporting the Nazi regime, or are you fighting against it, or passive, or where you stand there. But in the post-war time, what they did was they kind of took a note from Bismarck and tried to create one church. But they divided it into 20 sections. So this is the current church in Germany, and each one of those sections is considered a church. We would probably say a synod, and they use the term evangelical. They have, but the catch is that some of it is Reformed and some of it is Lutheran. So the Lutherans are definitely the dominant. The dark blue that you see are sections that are Lutheran. But the lighter blue, not the super light little spot there, but the lighter blue is areas that are officially both Reformed and Lutheran. And for the whole country officially today, there is both pulpit and altar communion between Reformed and Lutheran. So if you are a pastor and you're educated in the Lutheran tradition, you can become a member without any issues at all to a Reformed-based church. Then that little light blue spot, and there's another spot on there somewhere that I don't remember where it is, has stayed Reformed. But this goes way back to those princes, who did it, and then Bismarck kind of imposing, hey, we're all one big happy family. So it is not fair to say when we say evangelisch or evangelical for German, that that's equal to Lutheran. It probably is, just odds would say, but depending on where you are, you could be in a church where the pastor is of the Reformed tradition. So that's something I didn't really realize until fairly recently, and I think it's kind of interesting. So let's see. So yeah, the 20 regional churches. So of the 20 regional churches, 10 are united Lutheran and Reformed, 8 are just Lutheran, and 2 are just Reformed. But again, it's somewhat of a distinction without actual clarity because officially you can go from one to the other without any issues. So when I was in college, I lived in Germany. I studied in Germany for a year. I enrolled directly in a German university for a year. And I also taught English at Berlitz. It was a great deal. I paid like $200 a semester, and that included my health insurance. You have to do it directly with the school, but I had a really smart advisor who told me, if you really want to do this, what you do is don't go through a program, fill out an application, and try to find a university where there's not a lot of Americans. And so I applied to Bielefeld. I don't know if anybody's heard of Bielefeld. It's actually a national joke because somebody started this rumor that Bielefeld doesn't exist because even the Germans have never been there. There's like no reason to go there. There's nothing. It was like completely destroyed during the war. So everything is modern, They have this one little tiny area that they rebuilt some of the old buildings. But for the most part, everything is new since the war, including the university that's there. It's actually a really good university, but it's kind of the last choice for Germans to go to, and no American has ever heard of it. So they accepted me. And it was great. It was a really good year. I had just met my wife before I left, so I had a reason to come back. If I hadn't met her, I might still be over there. But the whole point was when I applied to Berlitz, or when I filled out my paperwork for them, they had a blank for what is your religion. And at that time it said Protestants, Catholic, and then there was like a little space, and you had to go through a process if you didn't want to check one of those two things. And there's actually a fee involved if you don't check one of those things. And the reason is because of a church tax. So the government collects a tax unless you specifically opt out for the support of the church that you check off. So I checked evangelical, which basically meant I went to support this operation, a certain percentage of my money. I'd like to see the form now. I haven't seen one because Germany has gotten a lot more multicultural. So my guess is it's a little bit different now. They probably have added more options, but I did know some people who did not wish to pay the church tax, and it was a process. They had to, fill out extra paperwork to do that. It's similar in Scandinavian countries. One of the things, my wife is a linguist, and in graduate school, she had to study a non-Indo-European language as part of her program. And she chose Finnish. So you might be thinking, well, isn't Finland in Europe? Well, it is, but the language family is very distinct from German and French and Italian and all those other ones. It has something in common with Hungarian, oddly, and then a couple other languages kind of in the Ural Mountains that are kind of dying out. So anyway, she studied in Finland, and one of the statistics that I always thought was really amusing was they did a survey, this is now going back 30 years, but they did a survey of how many people believe in God. And they came out with this number, and it was fairly low. In fact, it was lower than the number of people who are officially members of the Finnish church. But, you know, that's how it kind of got woven into the fabric of life. And at least 30 years ago, it was still a thing. People wanted to be able to have a wedding in a church. Well, you need to be a member if you're going to do that. So they will pay this church tax even though they never darken the doorway of the church at all. So anyway, thank you for allowing me the digression here. So now I want to kind of get into the U.S. and talk a little bit about immigration into the U.S. So this is going to, fairly early, just around the Civil War time. And those dots, the darker the dots are, the more Lutherans there were in a certain area. This is a little deceiving at this time because this is a measure of people who are actually a member of a Lutheran church. And so there were definitely immigrants in some of these places that were so relatively, few people in that area that they didn't have a church yet. So they would have considered themselves Lutheran, but they were not a member of a church because there just wasn't a church within walking distance or horse distance. But you can kind of see that immigration started on the East Coast. And now when we think about immigration of Germans, you also have to remember that a lot of them were Roman Catholic. But then we also have things like the Amish and the Mennonites. So those were folks who did not fit into the Protestant, Lutheran, Reformed churches of the time in Germany and left due to, needing religious freedom. And they, of course, would not be on this map because they're not Lutheran. So churches churches in general are often organized on ethnic lines. So you go to Minnesota, and really even today, you go to a small town in Minnesota and you find a Lutheran church, and it's usually either going to be German or some sort of Scandinavian. That doesn't mean you're not welcome in a Norwegian church if you're German, but the vast number of people will be descended from immigrants from one particular country. Small towns very often had one Lutheran church that was centered on one ethnicity. If they were slightly larger towns, there might be Swedes and Germans living there. They'd have two churches, one for the Swedes and one for the Germans. And now part of the reason for this was that in these early days, these churches were generally in that language. So they were preaching in Swedish, or they were preaching in German, or preaching in Norwegian. And so it wasn't very welcoming if you didn't speak that language to go there. If we move a little bit further ahead, now you can see things really shifting into the Midwest. And so, you kind of think about what's happening in Europe, and it kind of informs a little bit about how things worked out here. In Sweden, Norway, most of the immigrants were coming for economic reasons. Either they were in a bad economic state where they were, and they wanted to get out of this poverty that they were in, or they saw opportunity, economic opportunity, and wanted to try to take advantage of that. Germans are largely the same reasons, but they added in avoiding the draft. I definitely have some relatives who immigrated to the US to avoid the draft. So that was a pretty big thing too. One of the big differences between Norwegians or Scandinavians and Germans is, in general, the Scandinavians were better educated. Most of the German immigrants were kind of at the bottom rung. Standards of education were just higher in Scandinavia. Yeah.
I don't see many Lutherans living in the West at that time. But my German relatives homesteaded south of Spokane in the late 1870s and early 1880s, and they did establish a Lutheran church there.
Yeah. One thing that's interesting about this map, which you have to keep in mind, is it's a percentage of the total population, not indicating were there Lutherans there. So if they were less than 2% of the population, they wouldn't be a colored dot there. And it surprises me a little bit how many areas do not reach that threshold in places where I thought there ought to be Lutherans there. And that's the case. When they first got there, they probably wasn't much of a church to speak of. And if there was, it may not have been a formal Lutheran church. So.
And my father was born in 1910, and he was confirmed in German.
Oh, right. Well, and I mean, my grandfather immigrated in the teens, it was after World War I, but not by a lot, so in the 20s, to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, which is, of course, a big area for Germans. And he attended services in German, and my mother remembers that, going to services in German, yeah.
Also, my family were German. They called it Deutsch, but then they heard Deutsch, they thought, oh, that's Dutch. It wasn't Dutch, but people there were so ignorant, and so they called them the Dutchmen, and that was the name of the schools. They would
Absolutely.
call them the Dutchmen.
Yep.
We were nothing Dutch. It was Deutsch. But that's the way it was.
Well, and the Pennsylvania Dutch, we use that as a term for like the Mennonites in Pennsylvania. Almost all of them are of German descent. There are very few actual Dutch people there. So the word for German in German is Deutsch, and it's not far from Dutch. The word Dutch shares the same beginning, so at one point you could use Dutch or Deutsch to mean anyone who is of Germanic, so there's a lot of confusion and crossover there, yeah.
The accents are very strong.
Yeah. And it is interesting, if you get to places in Pennsylvania where you actually hear people speaking, and if you know some German, it's a real mix, kind of right in between of German and ancient German, and it's a real interesting thing to hear. So, yeah.
When my grandparents came, my grandfather, I guess, came in, and they had to give their what they did, and their and he said, yeah, when they asked him questions, and it was very, very dark, and they say, what do you do? And he says, I'm a carpenter. They asked again, I guess, and carpenter. They put down on his entry form that he was a car painter. He was a carpenter.
I speak German pretty well, and my wife and I, she did a Fulbright in Sweden, so we lived in Sweden for a little bit. And it's always interesting how much you can pick up, when you know English, and if you know another Germanic language, and then go to a third one, and the Swedes are the best because, not very many people make an effort to speak Swedish when they're visiting, So I would ask, do you speak English? And they're like, but I'd say it in Swedish, right? Do you speak English? And I'd say it in Swedish. And they would always come back with a big smile. Do you speak Swedish? And they would like pull all the, whatever Swedish I had rattling in my brain, they would pull out. And they would laugh and laugh because my Swedish sounded German. And to them, that sounded like I was biblical. Because you go back in early Swedish, it's a lot closer to German, So it was like, some guy with robes coming out of the Dead Sea talking to them in their language. But they were the best. They were really, really, really nice about it. But yeah, so, what you wound up having were these churches that were very specifically Norwegian or Swedish or German. And, in the early days, maybe before this, transportation wasn't so good. And, they'd get their pastors as immigrants too. And in some cases, they would send their pastors over to the old country to get trained because they didn't have an infrastructure for seminaries and things like that. So they realized that that was a problem. They needed to start training people, especially because the next generation was speaking English. They might understand a little bit of German or Swedish or whatever, but they were becoming Americanized. And so they needed to start offering, catechism and having services in English. And so they needed to have homegrown pastors. So they started to form synods. So groups of churches that could operate with the higher administrative level and could organize seminaries. And now these early synods were all based on ethnicity again. So you would have a group of 20, 30 churches that were all Norwegian that would band together and kind of start these processes going. And it didn't make any difference if there was a German church around the corner. They might be preaching pretty much the same thing, but they didn't cooperate in this way because it was still so ethnically based. So this state of affairs, there was a lot of synods and there was merging and whatnot as transportation got better. The synods became bigger and tried to, join together with like-minded folks to have bigger operations, bigger organizations, make it easier to train pastors and that type of thing. So just to give you an idea, let me switch here. Here's the 1926 and 1950. Again, it's remarkable how little there is in the far west in terms of percentage of the people.
Gradually getting that way.
But it shows it around Spokane.
Yeah, there is a little section there. Yeah, and there's a lot in Texas. There are a lot of German immigrants to Texas, which I think is kind of interesting. So this kind of state of affairs where the synods were very ethnic-based lasted until the 1960s. We don't often think of it that way, but it's really true. So just to kind of give you an idea, and this is not, encyclopedic at all, but so in 1917, 3 Norwegian synods formed the Norwegian Lutheran Church of America. In 1918, 3 German language synods formed the United Lutheran Church in America. In 1930, the Joint Synod of Ohio, the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Iowa, and the Buffalo Synod, all German, formed the American Lutheran Church. So we're starting to get closer now to ELCA. In 1960, The American Lutheran Church merged with the United Evangelical Lutheran Church, which was Danish. So the American Lutheran Church was German. The United Evangelical Lutheran Church was Danish. And the Evangelical Lutheran Church, which was Norwegian, formed the American Lutheran Church, the ALCA. So many of you might have the ALCA in hand. So there are certainly exceptions. There are so many small synods that were joining and whatnot. But this is one of the first times where, in a fairly major way, you had Scandinavians and Germans getting together. The Lutheran Free Church, which was Norwegian, eventually joined the ALCA in '63. And then 2 years after the formation of the ALCA, in a parallel development, the ULCA joined with the Augustana Evangelical Lutheran Church, which was Swedish, and the Finnish Evangelical Lutheran Church, and the American Evangelical Lutheran Church, which was Danish, to establish the Lutheran Church in America, the LCA. Okay, so there's another one that's now starting to get in our lifetimes more, right? The LCA. So all of these various synods were starting to form up. The Wisconsin Synod and the Missouri Synod were similar to all these other synods. They were just a Lutheran synod, but they chose not to join up. And they haven't joined up to this day. And so it's hard to make generalizations here, but you know, this is kind of the period where a lot of churches started dropping out of the synod they were in and joining another one because they didn't like how conservative or how liberal a particular synod was. So I know in my family, there were definitely people who were attending a church in one synod one day, and then a few weeks later, the council voted and they were in a completely different synod. That certainly was a thing. So finally, on January 1st, 1988, that's when the ALCA and the LCA joined to form the ALCA. There was one other group, and this is kind of interesting. So the Missouri Synod at this time was kind of in this middle ground between a lot of the ELCA churches and the Wisconsin Synod. Some of the Missouri Synod churches would be just right at home with the very conservative Wisconsin Synod. Some of them were quite progressive and were perhaps more progressive than the churches that were forming the ALCA. The Missouri Synod, the leadership at this time got taken over by the very conservatives. And one of the things that they did was they cracked down on the seminary in St. Louis, Concordia Seminary in St. Louis. You were telling me, Steve, they threw out the head of the seminary, right?
Head of the seminary. There was the controversy. Big controversy was mainly about the inerrancy of the Bible, whether the Bible should be interpreted literally or not. And the personal opinion here, it was a religious argument. It was a political power play disguised as a religious argument. And it was during the early to mid 70s when fundamentalism in the United States was on the rise, and the religious fundamentalists were learning how to play politics.
Yes.
You remember the rise of Jerry Falwell and his so-called moral majority learning how to make political hay out of religious conservatism.
Right.
And that was happening in the Missouri Synod Lutheran Church as well. And there was a struggle in leadership, and they took advantage. This thing about biblical inerrancy and
We're going to talk about that a little more too, but keep going. Yeah.
The struggle was over something called the historical critical method of biblical analysis that had been taught in seminaries for close to 100 years by that time, but it was sort of used by the ultra-conservatives within the synod to for political purposes.
Yeah.
And there was a national convention in 1973 in the Missouri Synod that was, I guess you could say, hijacked by the ultra-conservatives. And the president of the Synod he was expected to be reelected, and he was not. It was an upset election, and a very conservative man by the name of Jacob Preuss was elected, surprisingly, and he took that opportunity to sort of clean house at the Concordia Seminary in St. Louis and forced out the president of the seminary, and that caused a big rift that caused the exodus of most of the faculty and students at that seminary.
Right. Yeah, so go ahead.
We were in the church that the ones who left came to our church,
Oh.
Bethel.
Wow.
And so we were in the middle. Oh, it was wonderful. We had all these pastors, and they knew everything. It was the special. It was like going to a wonderful restaurant with everything you'd want. It was so great. Later, they would go to Chicago and other places, and Pastor Brocker had a person who was one of our best friends. Our kids had some of the leftover clothes. I mean, we just were like family. And then every time I meet people from here and everywhere else, they know people from up there who came to California or to Chicago, but they were with us first. And what they had to say and do was amazing.
Yeah.
It was just like, wow.
Yeah. Yeah, so they wound up forming, a seminary in exile, they called it. Yeah, and they shortened it to Seminex.
And it was a Missouri Synod church, but it couldn't be anymore.
Right.
So they had it, and it wasn't yet, but it's ELCL now, but it was not.
Well, and what happened was they formed the Association of Evangelical Lutheran Churches. 250 churches or so broke away from the Missouri Synods and formed this new body. And then they became the third part of the ELCA when the ELCA was formed. So that's kind of how we got here. And so, part of the reason I was talking about, what was going on in Europe and whatnot is to just make the point that you can't draw a straight line from a church in Germany to a church in the United States. When people immigrated to the United States from Germany, they were ostensibly Lutheran, maybe Reformed, what have you, but they would move to these small towns in Minnesota or what have you. And the thing that bound them to the church they found was much more language and culture than these fine points of doctrine. All of these different Lutheran synods that came up, again, they kind of started out as being ethnic, but then eventually as time came on, they started to really get down to the nitty-gritty of, well, what exactly do we believe? How liberal or conservative are we going to be? That's all us. That's all what the United States created, these disagreements. Any thoughts or questions there? So today in the United States, there are more than this, more Lutheran groups. And maybe just a word about synods. It gets complicated because we use synod in lots of different ways. So kind of understand the original thing was just a band of churches that were working together for common good. And there were a zillion synods all across the country. Then they started to form larger synods. But then it kind of started to become used as a way to distinguish beliefs. And that wasn't the initial intention. And then just to make it more confusing, the ELCA needs to have some geographical boundaries to make this gigantic structure more manageable. And they decided to use the word synod. So we have the Oregon Synod, which is a group of churches within the ELCA Synod. So it's confusing, but we got to try to keep track of whether we're talking about a little synod or a big synod here. But for this purposes now, we're talking about religious organizations that generally do not cooperate with each other. They are kind of distinct entities. These are the three biggest Lutheran synods in the United States. There are more, but these are the three biggest. These are the three that have over 1,000 churches in the U.S. each. So the ELCA is the largest, that's what we're a part of. 8,500 congregations, roughly 2.79 million people. That may not be completely accurate. As you know, we are losing both churches and members. The Missouri Synod, 5,900 congregations, 1.7 million people. And the Wisconsin Synod goes by WELS, W-E-L-S, a lot. 1,241 congregations at last count, and 330,687 members. So, the differences. So these are what I came up with as the main things that the synods disagree on when it comes to doctrine. There's other differences in terms of how they kind of view life, if you will. And I think I've mentioned before, I am a product of the Wisconsin Synod. So I grew up in the Wisconsin Synod. I went to a Wisconsin Synod elementary school and Wisconsin Synod high school, and then was thrown out of the Wisconsin Synod. So I am not really welcome there anymore for anything like communion or what have you. So inerrancy of the Bible, that's what Steve was talking about before. Generally speaking, the Missouri Synod and the Wisconsin Synod both say that the Bible is perfect, that you must follow every word in the Bible. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and it goes back to also to something called absolutism, that the Bible means the same thing in every place and every time. And the opposite point of view is the Bible must be interpreted in the context of its historical and cultural context, right? So,
exactly.
Right.
Well, and if you want, I can show you some places in the Bible where they're talking about something historical, and I have some pretty darn good documentation that it just did not happen. There's reasons for that, and the Wisconsin Synod especially, which is what I'm most familiar with, will go into incredible gymnastics to explain these things that just really couldn't have happened that way. And they make a lot of hay with what is a parable and what is an allegory and what we need to, just in order to try to get everything to fit in these super neat boxes of, every word is perfect. And I mean, another thing we have to understand is that we read translations of the Bible. And anybody who's worked with languages knows that translations cannot be perfect. It's impossible to convey every single nuance. And we even have a couple books of the Bible where we don't have the original words it was written in left to us. The only thing that survives is a translation of what was originally written. And so, that's where the ELCA and the other ones really differ in that area. The Book of Concord is something that all Lutherans have some amount of reverence for. The Book of Concord was published way back in 1580. So this is, again, another one of these efforts to get everybody on the same page. That was really important to the princes to try to get everybody believing the same thing. And It contains the creeds that we use. We use 3 general creeds quite a lot. It contains the Augsburg Confession, Luther's Small and Large Catechism, and like I say, all 3 hold this in some esteem. But the Wisconsin Synod and the Missouri Synod will say that we believe the Book of Concord is important because it follows the Bible perfectly. And the ELCA says the Book of Concord is wonderful where it follows the Bible. So they make this little bit of wiggle room that there are some areas in the Book of Concord where it's problematic with the Bible. That's probably over dramatic because problematic sounds really negative, but there's wiggle room there to have some interpretation. And the Wisconsin Synod and the Missouri Synod give you no wiggle room. That's kind of a theme with the Wisconsin Synod. Communion, of course, communion. But here the main difference is open versus not open communion. So the basic idea is if in the ELCA anybody comes to the table, we will serve them communion. And I'm much more familiar with the Wisconsin Synod. I'm not sure exactly how it works in the Missouri, but in the Wisconsin Synod, you generally have to go into the office before the service and you have to fill in your name and your Wisconsin Synod church in a book. And, you know, if the pastor is on his toes like he's supposed to be, and emphasis on he will not serve you communion if you cannot establish that you are a member of a Wisconsin Synod church. And it goes even beyond communion, too. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I can speak for the Missouri. I grew up in the Missouri Synod Church, so I can speak to that. And in fact, I can give you an example. When my mother passed away, I wanted the day after was a Sunday, and I wanted to take communion with my dad. But of course, I was a member of the ELCA by that time. So Dad had to take me into church to talk to the pastor because, as Paul mentioned in the Wisconsin Synod, it's the same in the Missouri Synod. You had to go in and register before you could take communion. And so we had to explain that I was not a member of a Missouri Synod church. And so the pastor said, well, I have 2 questions for you. See, I had to pass a test before he would allow me to take communion. The first question was, do you believe in the real presence of Jesus Christ in the sacrament? Well, that was an easy one because I do, you know. The ELCA agrees with the other synods about the real presence of the body and blood of Christ. The second question was a little bit more difficult for me. He said, do you believe in the inerrancy of the Holy Scriptures? Well, I was determined to take communion with my dad the day after my mother passed away. So God help me, I lied. Okay, so that's my story about communion in the Missouri Synod.
Well, and this isn't directly communion, but I'll give my own story too. My mother was a social worker, was rather socially progressive in many, many ways, but never left the Wisconsin Synod. And when she died, wished to have her service in the Wisconsin Synod, so we respected that. My sister is still in the Wisconsin Synod as well. So we invited my aunts and my niece, who loved to sing and have lovely voices, to sing in her funeral. My aunt is Wisconsin Synod. My niece is Missouri Synod. They were not allowed to sing at my mother's funeral. So I have some scars. But that just gives you an idea of how strict they are in that area.
Okay, I'm going to add one more quick one. But when my father died, or was dying, he was really sick. I was raised ALC, Norwegian, And my dad was really sick, and he went to live with my sister and brother-in-law, who at that time were in the Missouri Synod, and their Missouri Synod pastor refused to give my dad communion because he wasn't, the pastor couldn't be sure that he understood, you know. And they take such ownership of making sure that if you take communion, you are worthy and you know what's going on. And so my sister and her husband, after that, really made my sister mad. So they left that church, and I thought, yay! And then they joined Wisconsin Synod.
Yeah, and now of course they have a biblical basis for believing that. There is something in 1 Corinthians about he who eats and drinks in an unworthy manner eats and drinks to his damnation. And so the pastors in those synods feel it's their responsibility to make sure that people are worthy. Otherwise,
They are contributing to damnation.
contributing to damnation. Yeah. So
No, that's exactly right. They take that extremely seriously.
They do.
And that is the basis for taking it extremely seriously. So I'm going to just move ahead here a little bit. Choice. The Missouri Synod and the Wisconsin Synod would say that the ELCA is pro-choice. If you actually read the ELCA documents, they are a masterpiece of obfuscation. We respect the rights of women, blah, 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 blah. It's really something. I'm hoping that gets worked on at some point. But at least, at a minimum, the official ELCA documents can imagine a situation where a woman might have an abortion and it's not the worst thing in the world. And Wisconsin and the Missouri Synod are just clearly, no, we are anti-choice. Marriage and ordination, of course, the LCA has now gotten to a point where it is officially approved for LGBTQ folks to be ordained, be married, whatnot. That is absolutely not okay in the Missouri and Wisconsin Synod. And origin of life, so we're talking about creation. Again, there's not exactly this firm statement that makes everything super, super clear in the ELCA, but there is space for evolution within the framework of what's written in the Bible. There is no space whatsoever in the Wisconsin and Missouri Synod. It was 7 days, this is how it happened, boom. It's exactly, the way it's traditionally been interpreted in the church. Now you'll notice with all of these, I pretty much grouped the Wisconsin Synod and the Missouri Synod together, and for the most part, that's reasonably true. There are differences there, and the biggest one is the biggest one in my opinion is how the Wisconsin Synod does not work and play with others at all. They do not see any room for cooperation with somebody who is not 100% on board with every single aspect perfectly. One of those aspects is the role of women in the church. In the Wisconsin Synod, women may not vote. In the Missouri Synod, at least, women can take certain roles of leadership. They're not allowed to be in the clergy. And just based on that one thing alone, the Wisconsin Synod has distanced itself from the Missouri Synod. There was a time when they were cooperating some. That time is now gone, and they do not cooperate in any way at all. I think there's also just a lot of room for making a distinction between overall conservatism, that aren't necessarily specifically doctrine. My high school did not have a prom because dancing. Kids might fall into sin. After much protesting, we did have one year a dance, and there were parents hovering. I mean, it was unbelievable, and I don't know if that's ever been revived, but I got the feeling that was a failed experiment. Growing up, I was lectured at length from the pulpit about who to vote for, those types of things. So there was definitely a conservatism that went beyond just doctrinal issues. I do feel like the Missouri Synods, the range of how conservative Missouri Synod churches are fairly large. I think their most liberal would be fairly comfortable in the ELCA, and their most conservative would be very comfortable in the Wisconsin Synod.
Yeah, I think that's true when I was a kid. I'm not sure after the Seminex split that that's true today.
I have some evidence to suggest that it is, but less so than it used to be. That's for sure.
Yeah. Missouri Synod used to be quite wide-ranging in from conservative to progressive, but less today than it used to be.
Well, and one of the things Steve and I were talking about before the class, the folks who left in Seminex and whatnot may have been more liberal than the people who were in the rest of the ELCA. So it's possible the folks from the Missouri Synod actually pulled the ELCA to the left, or to be less conservative, which is kind of an interesting way of looking at it. Any questions about that? Any other thoughts?
A quick question. So we have the Missouri Synod,
Yep.
and then we have the ELCA with a lot of synods, and this came up with our new member session. Is there a Missouri Synod within the ELCA? Like an Oregon Synod?
We were asking ourselves.
We looked that up.
We looked it up. There is, I believe it's called Central States Synod. And there are enough ELCA churches in Wisconsin that they need to have multiple. So it kind of naturally avoids confusion. There is a Milwaukee Synod. There is I think it's a southwestern Wisconsin Synod. So they use directionals to kind of divide it up. But there is no Missouri Synod in the ELCA, and there is no Wisconsin Synod, period, in the yeah. Larry?
My sister and brother-in-law both went to PLC, Pacific Lutheran College, in the 1950s, and they did not allow dancing.
Oh, well, there you go. All right, we've come a long way. Any other thoughts or questions? We're a little over time here, so I appreciate your patience. All right, I will dismiss you. Thank you so much. Thanks.